let's just see how it goes. Okay, vocabulary and language. What words do children and adults really use, and how do they use them? Core vocabulary makes up 3/4 of what adults and children actually say and is often ignored in the design of AAC systems. 78% of the words we use daily are drawn from a core of fewer than 400 words. Now, that may be a bit surprising as a statistic because it's tremendous good news. I remember the first time I encountered this, I was working at the Westinghouse Electric Corporation, and I was setting up an artificial intelligence system to note how the surface structure in a language situation to express an obligation, so they could do an automatic, they could have an automatic program that would show them certain obligations in certain kinds of contracts that they had. And these contracts, or these operating procedures that were in essence contracts, were huge. They had a couple thousand pages apiece, and there'd be 5 or 6 volumes of these contracts for one, say, massive power plant. And I started going volume by volume, and I noticed that in each chapter, which was about 10 or 12 pages, that there were about 800 or 900 words that were used many times, and then 200 or 300 words that were used one time. And then I went to the next chapter, and I found the same thing. And I actually found that, chapter after chapter, there was a core vocabulary that was being used, and it was the same from chapter to chapter to chapter. And I was quite amazed at this. This was back in the 70s. I was quite perplexed, but now we know a great deal more about that. 78% of the total words you say come from a core of fewer than 400 words. Why is that good news? Well, it can give us a very reasonable target for AAC vocabulary selection. Core vocabulary also is consistent across populations, activities, places, topics, and demographic groups. Now, this should run somewhat counter to the grain of most of what we think and most of our intuitions, but I'm going to spend an awful lot of today trying to demonstrate this to you. What I found was it didn't matter whether the chapter in the final safety analysis report for a power plant was talking about internal water piping, or whether it was talking about internally generated missiles, or it was talking about externally generated missiles. The base vocabulary from each of these chapters was always the same. It was only kind of a little cream on top that was different. And what you can find by actual data and by looking at scientific studies, which I'm going to be showing to you, you can show that the core vocabulary, the words we use all the time, are consistent across clinical populations. In other words, children use the same core words as adolescents, and children and adolescents use the same core words as adults. Adults use the same core words as people over 75, people who are called elderly. And they use these core words regardless of what activity they're involved in, where they're involved in whatever activity they're involved in, the topics of their conversation, and their demographics or their social groups. So if we were with a group of people in poverty in the Appalachians in a church study program, and they were talking about the book of Job, we would find that we did an analysis of 10,000 of the words that were said during a 2-day study period, that the core words there would be identical to the core words of a professional meeting in Los Angeles. And this is great good news, because I believe many of us have spent an awful lot of time finding those special words for each environment. Haven't you? and spent an awful lot of time programming those in. And in fact, a dominating part of your interaction with students is through the medium of vocabulary selection and tuning the system for classes, for activities. Is this? Yeah. I'm going to question the validity of not all of that activity, but of a lot of that activity. And I'm also going to introduce a linguistic term called picture producer. Picture producer comes from the Schenck and Abelson language analysis, usually called conceptual dependency notation. I just gave you that as background because picture producer sounds like such a stupid little phrase, but it's in the midst of this highly technical approach for conceptual dependency notation. And conceptual dependency notation is an effort to build a language description, a description of a phrase or a sentence that is language independent. And if you know the rules for putting it into the interlingua, and you know the rules for taking it out of the interlingua in two different languages, you can take an English sentence, put it into the interlingua, and have it come out as a Russian sentence on the other side. And have you seen where they're actually doing machine translation? Well, machine translation is in fact based on conceptual dependency notation, and words that produce pictures have certain characteristics that are translingual. And so one of the things you note about a word is whether it is a picture producer or not when you're building an interlingua. Okay, I hope that wasn't gilding a lily there, but that's the whole story on the term picture producer.